At first light, when the dew is still on the paving stones and the hedge gives off that cold green smell, the Dunnock is already moving. That is the part most people never see. It happens in a narrow, easy to miss window before the garden fills with noise, before the louder birds take the higher branches, before the day feels awake. If you stand by your window with a mug in your hand and keep your eyes low, under the hedge line, you may catch it. A small brown shape slipping forward in a mouse like shuffle, almost more motion than body. And that is our first sign. Number one, the bird feeds low, not proudly, not out in the open. It works the ground the way a careful hand feels along a shelf in the dark. Short steps, tiny pauses, head tilting, then another little run. It is not hopping around the feeder like the birds people expect to notice. It stays under cover, where the leaf litter is soft and the shadows still matter. If you have one in your garden, you may have seen it vanish so quickly that you questioned whether it was even there. But it was there. It just prefers the edge of things. That edge is important. A Dunnock does not read a garden the way a showy visitor does. It reads it like a map of safety and habit. One side of the hedge, then the patch of bare earth, then the low stems by the fence, then back again. The bird returns to those same little lanes because they already mean something to it. Familiar food, familiar cover, familiar distance. And once you start watching that pattern, you notice something else. It does not behave like a bird passing through. It behaves like a bird that already knows where everything is. A resident male makes that even clearer. He sings from the same quiet perch, usually low and a little hidden, at the edge of the ground he has claimed. It is a fast, fine warble, almost like someone murmuring to themselves, and because it is so soft, many people miss it entirely unless the garden is still. But that little song matters. It is a boundary marker, a statement made gently but firmly that this patch of ground is known. And then there is the first light window itself. You may think the bird is just early. It is more exact than that. It feeds most when the light is thin and the garden is not yet busy, when the air is cool and the cover is still holding the night. That timing tells you something about trust. The Dunnock has chosen the safest hour, the quietest hour, the hour when it can move close to the hedge and stay low without being pushed aside. So, if you want to know whether the bird in your garden is a visitor or something more settled, start with the hour it appears. Start with the ground under the hedge. Start with the tiny shuffle that looks almost too ordinary to matter. Because that ordinary moment is where the story begins. And the next sign is even easier to miss, if you are not looking close enough. If you enjoy slow backyard nature stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. And once you've seen that first pattern, the next one starts to make sense. Because the bird does not just feed low, it changes the way it leaves. That is the second sign, and it is one of the quietest pieces of evidence you can get in a garden. Ornithologists would call it a change in flight initiation distance, which is just a formal way of saying how close you can get before the bird decides to take off. With a shy, unsettled bird, that distance can be long. One step and it is gone. But with a familiar Dunnock, it begins to shrink. So gradually that you might only notice it when you compare today with a week ago, or this spring with the one before it. You walk out with a watering can or a pair of gloves, or just to check the soil after rain. The air still smells damp. The hedge is holding a little shade. And there it is again, low in the border, moving in that mouse-like shuffle. But this time, it does not vanish the second you turn your head. It keeps going. It pauses. It pecks once. It shuffles a few inches farther along the same line of cover. The bird is not ignoring you. It is reading you. And that reading is the real story here. A resident bird does not become fearless. What it does is sort you into the category of things that belong in its world. The gardener who waters the same bed every morning. The person who clips the hedge and then leaves. The shape moving slowly near the fence, never lunging, never looming, never crossing the hidden line where the bird feels safe. Over time, the bird's retreat gets shorter because your presence keeps proving the same thing. Nothing terrible follows. That is why this sign matters so much. A Dunnock that keeps shuffling close instead of bolting is not being tame in some cute, simple way. It is showing habituation, which is a real and measurable shift in behavior. It has learned the rhythm of the place. It knows the footsteps. It knows the pauses. It knows that you are part of the pattern now, not a break in it. And if you watch carefully, you can see the difference between a visitor and a resident right there in one morning. A visitor leaves the instant the space feels shared. A resident stays low, keeps working, and only slips back a little, just enough to keep the hedge between itself and the wide open. That little adjustment tells you everything. The garden is not just a stop. It is a familiar map, and you are on it. That is why people miss this sign so often. They expect trust to look obvious. They expect the bird to come close and pose and make itself easy to notice. But the Dunnock is more careful than that. Its trust is practical, measured, built from repeated mornings, repeated paths, repeated choices not to flee. And once you notice that, you start looking for what comes next. Because if the bird is willing to stay this close to you, the real question is where else it chooses to stay, and whether it returns to the same patch for reasons even deeper than habit. Number 3 is easier to hear than to see. If you stand still in the garden long enough, with the air cool and the hedge almost motionless, you may catch it from the same quiet perch again and again. A thin, fast warble coming from low branches at the edge of the space the bird has claimed. Low, half hidden, like the sound belongs to the boundary itself. That matters more than people think. A songbird's voice is not just music. It is territory behavior. And with this bird, the song is tied to a place that has been chosen carefully, then defended quietly. The male doesn't need to shout to make the point. He repeats the same song from the same spot, or the same few spots, until the garden starts to feel marked by routine. One twig, one fence line, one branch that barely bends under him. Then, the next morning, the same thing again. You can almost miss how specific it is. That is the strange part. The ordinary listener hears a little warble and moves on. But if you are watching the garden like a map, the pattern becomes obvious. The bird is not roaming around trying to impress every corner at once. He is using those repeated low perches to anchor himself to the edges of the ground below. He is saying, in the language he has, "This strip is mine, and I know it well enough to sing from here without hesitation." And once you notice that, the rest of the garden starts to change shape around him. Because a resident bird doesn't just return to feed. It returns to the same lines, the same cover, the same little points of reference. The song sits on top of that. It tells you the bird has not only settled in, but arranged its days around a familiar patch of space. That is what belonging looks like here. Repetition. If you have one in your own garden, listen for where the sound comes from after the first burst of dawn. Is it always the same low branch near the hedge? The same post beside the path? The same small rise in the grass where the bird can see and stay protected at once? Those details are not random. They are the visible edge of a life that has started to trust the place enough to keep speaking from it. And there is a deeper reason this sign matters. A bird will not keep choosing the same perch if the ground beneath it still feels temporary. It settles on a site only after it has learned the cover, the food, the movement, the rhythm of the place. The song is one more layer of that learning, one more return. So if you hear the same fast warble from the same low point tomorrow morning and the morning after that, you are not just hearing a bird sing. You are hearing it confirm the map. And the next sign is even more revealing because it changes how close the bird will let you stand before it decides you are part of that map too. And that same quiet perch is only part of the picture because the bird keeps proving something else every time you come back to the garden. Number 4 is about return. Not just a return to feed, but a return to the same patch, the same sheltered strip of ground, the same little roots under the hedge where the leaves stay damp a little longer after rain. That kind of repetition has a name in animal behavior: site fidelity. And with the Dunnock, you can see it without ever opening a field guide. You just need patience and a garden that lets you watch the same corner more than once. The first time, you may think you're seeing an ordinary bird moving through cover. The second time, you notice it is using the same shallow run along the edge of the border. The third time, you realize it is choosing. The bird comes back to the exact places that already feel safe to it. And it does that with a kind of quiet confidence that is easy to miss if you are not standing still. Low light, damp soil, a faint smell of crushed leaves, the hedge holding back the wind. That is the setting where this becomes visible. And once you notice the return pattern, the garden stops feeling random. It starts to feel inhabited in a deeper way. A resident bird does not only know where the food is, it knows where the cover is thickest, where the ground opens, where the line of sight is good, where a human can stand without forcing it to leave. It knows which corner it can use in early morning and which edge it can cross later in the day. That is why the bird keeps reappearing in the same patch. It has already done the mental work of deciding this is worth coming back to. Not for one meal, for the whole season. That is the part most people miss. They see a bird one day, then another day, and they think of separate visits. But for a Dunnock, those visits can be pieces of one continuing choice. The same body, the same hedge, the same sheltered ground under the shrubs. Over time, the repeated visits become a pattern of residence. And residence is what makes a garden start to matter as home. If you look closely, you can feel the shift in the bird's posture when it settles into a place like that. The movement stays low, but it becomes more economical. Less testing, fewer sharp retreats, a little more time spent in the open bits between cover and cover, as if the bird already knows how far it can go before it needs to duck back in. That is a map being used from memory. And memory is where this sign gets interesting. Because once a bird keeps returning to the same patch year after year, you are no longer just watching a visitor with habits. You are watching the beginning of a life tied to one piece of ground so closely that the next thing it does there becomes the strongest proof of all. And that stronger proof begins when the garden is no longer used only by one careful adult. Number 5 is the moment the bird brings its young into the same patch of ground it already knows. Right there, along the familiar edge, through the same shelter, over the same damp soil and leaf litter that the adults have already judged safe enough to live in. If you ever see that happen, you are watching something far more important than a feeding visit. You are watching the map being handed on. A newly fledged bird looks different in a way that catches your eye even before you fully understand why. The feathers can seem softer, looser, not yet carrying that neat, finished look of the adults. The body is a little uncertain in its balance. The movement is less efficient. Instead of that practiced little route through cover, you may see a pause that lasts too long, a flutter upward that lands awkwardly, a moment of hesitation at the lip of a bare patch of ground. And then, close by, one of the adults appears and keeps moving through the patch as if demonstrating the place step by step. That is what makes this sign so powerful. The bird is not simply raising young somewhere in the general area. It is using your garden as a teaching ground. You may see the younger one waiting low in the greenery while the adult works nearby. You may notice the older bird leading it toward the safer side of the border, away from exposed ground and back toward the cover it already trusts. You may hear the thin, insistent calling of a youngster and then see the adult return, alert but not panicked, as if this whole corner of the garden is already part of a plan. Because for that family, it is. The patch has structure, shelter, known escape lines, known foraging spots, known morning timing. All the things that make a place worth raising a bird in. And that is where belonging becomes something more than routine. A bird can visit a garden many times without ever tying its future to it. It can use the space, benefit from it, then disappear when conditions change. But once it starts bringing young into that same strip of cover, once the next generation is learning the place under adult guidance, you are no longer looking at simple familiarity. You are looking at commitment. The garden has become part of the bird's life cycle, not just its daily schedule. Most people miss this because fledglings are untidy, quick, and easy to mistake for some brief bit of summer commotion. But if you slow down and watch where they are being led, the pattern appears. The same edges, the same low shelter, the same chosen patch that held the adult in place now holds the young as well. And there is one more layer to this, a harder, stranger layer, because this species is known for something that turns nesting into a very different kind of story. Once you know that, you start hearing those quiet family scenes with entirely new ears. That harder, stranger layer is this. The patch that held the young can hold a burden, too. Number 6 is the one people often don't expect from such a small, quiet bird. The Dunnock is a frequent cuckoo host. That means its nesting life is not just about returning to the same ground year after year. It also has to keep functioning in a system where another bird may use its nest, its time, and its trust. And even with that pressure, it still comes back to the place. That is the part that stops me every time. Because a garden where this happens is not a casual stopover. It is a place the bird knows deeply enough to keep investing in, even when the stakes are higher than they look from the path. You may not see the nest itself. You may only notice the adult slipping through the same low cover, keeping close to the hedge, vanishing and reappearing in that quick, careful way. But if the bird is still here, season after season, in this patch, working the same edges, then something larger is going on than feeding or passing through. The bird is making a decision, again and again. A lot of people think of trust as something soft. With a bird like this, it is more exact than that. Trust is whether it will keep using the same cover after one breeding season is over. Trust is whether it will come back to the same bed, the hedge line, the narrow run of shelter the next year, even after the old nest is gone and the ground has been cut back and the air smells different. That kind of return is not sentimental. It is behavioral memory. It is a living creature saying, "This place still works for me." And if you watch closely, you start to see how much that matters in a small space. The adult keeps to the familiar border. The movement stays low. The bird works the same lanes in the grass and the leaf litter, and then it comes back again, as if the patch itself is part of the nest cycle. That is what makes the garden feel occupied rather than visited. The same individual keeps re-entering the same system, as if the ground has been written into its life. This is why the cuckoo detail matters so much. It doesn't weaken the sign, it sharpens it. A bird that keeps breeding in this patch, year on year, even with that extra pressure, is telling you the place is still worth the effort, still safe enough, still known enough, still home enough to try again. And once you understand that, the whole garden starts to look different. The hedge is not just cover. The border is not just a border. The low shade under the shrubs is part of a repeated life, one that keeps opening and closing in the same narrow spaces. So when you see the adult again, moving through the leaf litter like it never really left, you may be seeing more than a resident. You may be seeing a bird that has already decided to raise the next year there too, and maybe the year after that. That same patch does not hold one bird alone. Number 7 is where the garden starts to sound like a community. A community. The Dunnock is small, quiet, and easy to miss on its own, but once you pay attention, you begin to notice how it reacts when the other birds in the garden shift their tone. A sharp call from one corner, a brief hush under the hedge, a little movement at the feeder edge, and the whole space changes shape for a moment. This is what people often overlook. They think each bird is just doing its own thing. But resident birds, especially one that keeps returning to the same patch, are reading the signals around them all the time. A sudden alarm from a neighboring bird does not stay separate. It ripples through the ground cover, through the low branches, through the little lanes where the Dunnock works. The bird lifts its head. It freezes for a beat. It shuffles back under cover. Then it watches. That is not random nervousness. That is shared information. And the more familiar the garden becomes, the faster that response gets. You may see it on an ordinary morning with wet grass and a pale sky. The bird is feeding low under the hedge, moving in that mouse-like shuffle, when another bird gives a warning note from deeper in the garden. The Dunnock does not need to understand every sound in the same way a louder, more dominant bird might. It only needs to know that this place has a language, and that language matters. Over time, it learns what signals mean pause, what signals mean cover, and what signals mean everything is still calm enough to keep working. That is the science of it, plain and simple. A resident does not live in isolation. It lives inside a network of repeated cues. And in a garden, that network can be surprisingly rich. The same thing happens with your presence, by the way. A person opening the back door, a step across the path, a voice near the border, a familiar human shape moving slowly enough not to break the rhythm of the place. The Dunnock notices all of it, but it does not react to every sound the same way. That difference is important. It means the bird has started sorting the garden into categories: safe noise, strange noise, useful noise, noise that means step back under cover and wait a moment. Once you see that, the bird stops looking like a solitary little forager and starts looking like part of a functioning neighborhood. And that is the real wonder here. This tiny bird, working low in the shadows, is not just surviving in your garden, it is participating in it. It is sharing the same warning system, the same timing, the same quiet understanding of which moments call for stillness and which ones do not. That only happens after a place has been known for a long time. So if you ever notice the Dunnock pausing at the exact instant the garden seems to change around it, pay attention. That pause is not empty. It is listening to a whole invisible web of signals that only a resident would trust. And if that seems small, wait until you see what happens when the bird is old enough or settled enough not to leave at all. And that is why the next sign feels so quiet. Number 8 is not about noise or song or even movement at first. It is about absence and the fact that the bird never quite disappears from the same patch, even when the garden itself seems to go slack. In the bright, busy months, you may catch it under the hedge or slipping through the border. But later, when the air turns thinner and the ground goes dry, the same individual can still be there, just enough to remind you that this place still belongs in its life. That is what people miss when they look only for obvious activity. They assume a resident bird should always be easy to see. But a Dunnock does not advertise its loyalty. It keeps it low. It keeps it tucked into routine. The patch still matters on dull mornings, on windy ones, on mornings when the garden is nearly empty and the soil smells faintly of dust instead of rain. That persistence is not random. It is the shape of attachment. You can read it in the way the bird uses the same covered lanes month after month. You can read it in how it works the edge of the bed without crossing too far into open ground, even when there is little competition around it. You can read it in the way it seems to know the garden is waiting for it, and it is waiting for the garden. That mutual waiting is its own kind of bond, just deeply, practically real. And this is where the science part is worth slowing down for. A bird that keeps returning across changing conditions is showing strong sight fidelity and strong reliance on a known territory. It is not drifting around looking for a better option every week. It has already settled the question in its own mind. This patch works. This cover works. These edges work. And because those things work, the bird keeps investing in them, even when the world around the patch changes shape. If you've ever watched one near dusk, when the light goes flat and the hedge turns into a dark line, you may have noticed how little it needs to do to feel present. A brief flick of movement, a tiny head turn, a pause in the leaves. That is enough. The bird is there, still using the place it has chosen, still carrying its own map in its head, still trusting the same narrow geography to hold it. And once you see that kind of steadiness, it starts to mean more than routine. It starts to look like a life that has been handed from one season to the next without breaking. Which is why the final proof is so hard to think about, and why most people never want to follow this trail all the way to the end. Because if a bird can belong to one patch that completely, then the last question is not where it goes next. It is how long it stays. And before you get to that last question, there is something important you need to feel all at once. By this point, the signs are no longer separate. They start to lock together. The first light feeding, the low song from a repeated perch, the shorter retreat when you step into the garden, the return to the same patch through changing seasons, the young brought into familiar cover. None of those things means much if you only notice one of them once. But when they gather in the same place, around the same strip of hedge and border and leaf-dark ground, they stop being little observations. They become evidence of a life arranged around your garden. That is number 9. The moment you realize the bird has woven your space into its daily geography so completely that the whole garden feels different to you. The path is no longer just a path. The hedge is no longer just something you trim back. The bare patch by the roots, the damp corner by the fence, the soft crumble of old leaves under the shrubs. Those become used places, known places, places with history in them. And the bird moving through them is not there by chance. It is there because the garden has met enough of its needs, often enough, over enough time, that staying makes more sense than drifting. That is the emotional shift most people never quite name. They think they are feeding birds, or attracting birds, or noticing birds. But a resident bird changes the meaning of the space itself. A Dunnock does this especially well because it does not ask for attention. It makes its claim through repetition, through return, through small acts that only start to feel large when you have seen them over and finally understand what they add up to. You can test this in your own garden without any special equipment. Think of one hidden strip of ground where the bird appears most often. Picture the exact angle it takes through the border. Picture where it pauses, where it slips back under cover, where you most often hear that quick, low song. If all of those details come to mind easily, then the bird has already taught you its map. You have learned the territory by watching the resident who lives there. And there is something deeply moving in that, even before the final sign arrives. Because wild creatures do not owe us that kind of visibility. They do not need to explain themselves. Most of the time, if they can live beside us without being understood, they do. So when one quiet little bird leaves enough repeated clues for you to see not just that it visits, but that it belongs, you are being shown something intimate in the plainest possible way. Not with drama, with consistency. The soft sound from the low branch, the familiar movement along the soil, the choice to remain when the garden is empty, the return when the season rolls over again. All of it says the same thing, just in different forms. This place is part of my life. And once you have heard that clearly, there is only one sign left to consider. The one no one likes to talk about. The one that turns residence into something deeper than routine and makes home mean exactly what it sounds like. And that last sign is the one that asks the most of you. Number 10 is not about song or feeding or the soft little route through the border. It is about what happens when a life spent in one patch of ground comes to its end there, often in a way so small that it could be overlooked entirely. A still shape tucked under the same hedge where you used to see movement. A few quiet feathers caught against damp stems. A place that suddenly holds memory instead of motion. For a resident bird, that matters. A Dunnock that has spent season after season using one strip of cover does not treat that ground as interchangeable. The place has been learned in detail. Shelter, escape lines, feeding lanes, the right low perch, the hour of first light, the corners where the air stays still in rough weather. So when an older or failing bird remains close to that known patch, it is not doing something sentimental in a human sense. It is doing something biological and very deep. It is staying within the only geography it has trusted enough to build a life inside. If you have ever found a small bird near the hedge and felt that strange pause before you even knew why, this may be part of what you were feeling. Recognition. The sense that the ground itself had been in use for longer than you understood. That this was not a random body in a random place, but the end point of hundreds of ordinary mornings. The same damp border, the same low cover, the same quiet returns that once seemed too small to mean anything. And that is the real revelation of the whole story. The garden does not become important because a bird visits it. It becomes important because a life can fit itself into that space so completely that every part of the place starts carrying use. The edge of the path, the leaves under the shrubs, the small opening by the roots, the branch that held the soft warble. By the time you understand what you have been watching, the bird has already told you everything it could tell. It fed there when the light was thin. It stayed when you stepped outside. It sang from the boundary. It brought the next generation into cover. It kept coming back. Then one day, the root is empty, and the emptiness is precise. That is how you know the little tracks in a garden are not small at all. A creature no heavier than a handful of leaves can press a whole life into one narrow strip of earth. And afterward, the space does not feel vacant. It feels used, the way a gate latch feels used, or the lowest step of a stair. The place remembers in its own way. By evening, the hedge is only a dark line again, and the soil under it looks undisturbed, except for one thin run where the leaves never seem to settle quite the same. If this made you look at your own garden a little differently, stay with the channel. And if a quiet bird has ever taught you a place by returning to it, I'd love to hear about that.